Right.
Okay.
Good evening and welcome to the 5th session of the Tiger Dialogues. Thank you all for joining us today. This series of panel discussions aims to bring together experts from diverse disciplines to deliberate on key themes and issues in the conservation of India's national animal. Previous sessions have dwelt on the historic decline of tigers and their recent revival, on the prominence of connectivity to perpetuate the species' future, on the deep impacts of poaching and wildlife trade, and of how the species adapts behaviorally to persist in increasingly crowded landscapes. Today's session, Whither People, Whither Tigers, Reconciling Discourses about People and Tigers in India's Forests, will dwell on vexed and very consequential issues for tiger conservation in India. As we all know, vast numbers of people, including many indigenous communities, live within or on the fringes of forests and grasslands in India, where they share space with tigers. India's laws both have provisions to create space for tigers by excluding people from protected areas or portions of protected areas. And more recently, processes have been set up to legally recognize the tenure and rights of forest-dwelling peoples. The consequences of inclusion and exclusion for people and wildlife are very significant, but only partially understood at best. Today's panel aims to develop a clear-eyed picture of the place of people and tigers and will outlay opportunities and limits for land sharing and land sparing. I'd now like to introduce Dr. Sejal Vora, today's moderator. Dr. Vora has worked in the field of natural resource management and sustainable development for over 30 years. She is currently program director at WWF-India, where she manages and provides strategic direction to an interdisciplinary team of over 300 professionals working on diverse aspects of biodiversity conservation and ecological footprint reduction. As a personal venture, Sejal has been instrumental in setting up and managing a private nature reserve in Uttarakhand that demonstrates the links between conservation, sustainable tourism, and local development. With that, I'd like to hand over to Sejal to introduce a great panel for today and take the session forward. Thank you all very much for being with us.
Thank you. I hope everyone can hear me. Thanks, Pranav. So I'm going to do the reverse. I'm going to first talk about a little bit about the session and then talk about our great panel. This, to me, arguably, I've been listening to this Tiger Dialogue series now. This is the 5th one, as Pranav said. To me, and maybe I'm biased, arguably, this is at the very core of tiger conservation. This particular issue of the people-forest interface is the core. And therefore, I'm very excited about this panel and this discussion. This is not a new discussion by any means. And all of us on this panel and many of the people listening in have probably been part of debates and discussions on this issue for many, many years. But it has changed. It has evolved. It's not static. Those debates and discussions are moving on. And in a way, this is also reflected in my own thinking and the evolution of my thinking about this issue. And I still recall, I got into this space during my PhD years when I was a wildlife researcher in a tribal district in South Gujarat. And this is when I first got exposed to the complexities and the realities and the tragedies to some extent of the interface between communities living in forest areas and conservation as we saw it in those days. That was my first kind of exposure, and I never went back from there. After my PhD, I spent a decade teaching, training, preaching about community-based conservation in many countries. And I still recall the doubt, the challenges, the skepticism. And I'm talking about 25, 30 years ago when we were, sort of pushing the bar on community-based conservation. It was difficult, but things have changed. Today, if you talk about the role of communities and conservation, there's pretty much a pretty wide acknowledgement to start with, and some acceptance, much more than it was in the past, about the importance of people and conservation, at least in the rhetoric. Almost most conservation organizations, many government officials will agree today that there is a role and a space for communities in conservation. Conversations are quite different today than they were 25, 30 years ago. However, we also know that the understanding and rationale about the role of communities in conservation varies. People have different reasons for saying it, and I'm not going to be skeptical here. But the point is that the dialogue has changed and evolved, and the acknowledgement certainly is there. We also have a landmark registration, as Pranav mentioned, the Forest Rights Act, which should pave the way for a more central and empowered space for communities in forest management. However, despite all of this, if you look at the conservation reality on the ground, by and large, we are still practicing a conventional conservation approach, which is trying as far as possible to keep communities and forests and different boxes, keep them apart, and continue with that paradigm or that narrative. So even though there are examples on the ground in India and elsewhere of people and wildlife and tigers sharing space, but the overarching narrative is still that coexistence is not possible. This is an artificial situation. In the long run, it will not work because human populations will increase, values and aspirations will change, economic development will take a priority, and therefore it's best to keep them apart because it's just not going to work. So what we want to try and do through this session is we want to try and understand what will it take to change this narrative. How do we go from a narrative of keeping people and forests apart and looking at it as not being able to coexist, to taking those positive examples on the ground and scaling up people-centered, inclusive conservation? What is holding us back? What can we learn from the collective wisdom of this panel and from all our experience that we've gathered over the years to see how we can push the bar on promoting and scaling up and to me, most importantly, changing this narrative that still seems to persist. So with that, I'd like to introduce the panel. We have, everybody calls every panel distinguished. So I'm also going to say we have a very distinguished panel, but a very interesting one. And I think what's exciting about this panel is that all of the people on it bring the best of on-the-ground experience and advanced thinking. Great thinkers, but people who've also worked on the ground and know the reality of what happens on the ground. So this is why I think this is a unique panel. If I started listing the achievements of everybody on this panel, we'll be here for a very long time. So I'm going to keep the introductions very short. But we've also got a little link in the chat. So if you want to know more about the background and the experience of the people on this panel, please use that link. It'll give you a lot more information. You can refer to it. I'll start with Asmita. Asmita is currently the professor at the School of Human Ecology at the Dr. B.R. Ambedkar University, where she works on the interface of development studies and political ecology, including conservation, rural livelihoods, agrarian change, forced displacement, and more. But before all of this, this sounds very interesting and exciting, but before all of this, I knew Asmita as the founder of Samrakshan Trust, which very early on, I think way before its time, was working with people in remote forest areas. And so Asmita brings a very, very strong background of working on the ground with communities. And then, of course, she's been an academic for a long time. So we're looking forward to hearing from her. Thanks, Asmita. MD Madhusudan. Madhu is currently doing independent research and is a visiting scientist at NCBS. He's also the co-founder and director of the Nature Conservation Foundation, which again was, I think, a very interesting model when it was set up because there was nothing like NCF when you started. Madhu is a conservation scientist who has for over 2 decades studied the interface between people and wildlife. But more than that, I know Madhu as someone who has trained and mentored many, many young people. And if I am anything to go by, I'm not young, but if I am anything to go by, he also must have really stretched their thinking and challenged lazy concepts. This is what he always does for me. He has a way of keeping you on your toes, and I'm sure you'll find out during this conversation. So thanks, Madhu, for joining us, and welcome. Ravi Chilam. Ravi is an old friend, a wildlife biologist, conservation scientist, with whom I have had many a discussion during the course of our respective careers, usually not agreeing on anything, agreeing to disagree, I think. Ravi started off with teaching at the WWF-India, moved on to leadership roles in a number of other organizations, to my great envy as somebody who's been stuck in one organization for my entire life. So he has a lot of experience to share with us. He is currently teaching at a number of different institutions and is the CEO of MetaString Foundation. Thanks, Ravi, for joining us. Dr. Sharad Lele. Sharad describes himself, and I'm going to read this because it was something that I wish I had written about myself. Sharad describes himself as an interdisciplinary environmental researcher, bridging the natural sciences, economics, and political science to understand the concepts and pathways to environmentally sustainable and socially just development. Beautifully said. I read that out only because I was so impressed with the way you articulated it. And, while I've probably worked with Sharad less than what the other people on this panel, I've read a great deal of what he's written. He's an incredibly prolific writer, but also a very readable one. So Sharad, thanks for all your writings that have really helped us, at least helped me clarify a lot of thoughts. Sharad is currently associated with ATRI, IISER Pune, and the Shiv Nadar University. So that's our panel. We'll jump right in now. The way we will run this is I will direct questions to either one or two panelists who will expound their thoughts on that in a fairly succinct and limited period of time, because we want to get through as much as possible. But we'll also open this up as a conversation. So any of the other panelists who would like to add something pertinent to that issue, just wave your hand or put up a hand signal. And you're most welcome to jump in at any time and talk about the issue. We will try and keep at the end of this session enough time for a discussion with the audience. And so there will be some kind of time management going on. Please bear with me if I sometimes have to move the conversation on or ask you to cut short your intervention. So with that, I'm going to jump right in. Let's start with why we need a conversation around sharing and sparing spaces. So I'll start with when we talk about tiger conservation in particular. I'll start with Madhu and Ravi. So, with your biologist's hat on, can you cast some light on this whole issue of how human disturbance impacts the biology and behavior of large carnivores and herbivores? Because we've seen in some places that, tigers in particular can withstand certain levels of disturbance and still thrive. So is there something like a tolerable limit of human disturbance? Because this is where the whole space sharing argument comes. What is that tolerable limit? Do we know anything about it? What might be such a threshold in terms of people, so-called disturbance and wildlife in a specific space? So Madhu, I'll open it to you, and then maybe Ravi has something to add as well.
Thanks, Sejal. I started looking at the relationship between people and nature largely in terms of their impacts, the impacts of people on wildlife, large wildlife, mostly mammals. And over time, I think it was, so being trained as a biologist, for me, I came with concern about endangered wildlife. And I thought biology really gave me all the necessary tools and concepts to understand how one could go about doing conservation, because it was a science and, it really could correct itself and help take us forward. So some of the work was about looking at the impacts of livestock grazing and of hunting by local communities and so on. So what some of that work that I did and many other colleagues subsequently have shown is that there are limits to a large and potentially dangerous animal like the tiger or a range of carnivores and people being able to share space. There are limits. But what I gradually became more aware of, which I certainly will concede I was not when I began, was I was only looking at a certain set of activities. I also used the same word that you used right now of disturbance. And I wasn't asking who determines what is disturbance. Is it the tiger, or have we just arrogated to ourselves the ability to give testimony on behalf of the tiger and say this is disturbance? So over time, I started to see my own, the kind of lenses and the framing that I was doing and the lenses through which I was looking at whatever I was doing. So yes, I was looking at the impact of local communities that resided in areas that we had set aside for wildlife, and the nature of their activity and how it impinged on wildlife populations, on behavior, and what this meant for sharing space. But I also saw fairly soon that there was a lot that would very justifiably we can gather in our embrace of what we think of as disturbance that we don't look at. I mean, I had big blind spots. I wasn't looking at the highways that were going through. I wasn't looking at the tourism. I wasn't looking at a whole range of things that today are very justifiably part of disturbance. And the whole narrative I had been part of was trying to craft this whole thing that it's the lives, the livelihood, and the activities of some of our most marginal people that was in the greatest collision with the objectives of tiger conservation. But I think that was one learning. I think the second thing was also that, while it was always very useful to go and start at the limits, there's also an enormous scope that one was looking away from. So what a species like the tiger or many other species of wildlife need are the conditions to thrive. And they really do not have any particular preference for an arrangement of governance or management that provides those conditions. So it doesn't say I need only a protected area. It has to be established under law, and it has to have people evicted from it. And I think across multiple places in the country and through the work of people who are doubtful about it, anxious about coexistence and so on, their own work, we have managed to see that species, even a species like the tiger that can be potentially so dangerous to people, their lives, their livestock and so on, can actually thrive in areas that have significant human populations. It's really about what happens in a place and how we manage what happens in a place, rather than a particular legal arrangement or a particular governance arrangement that is going to determine whether coexistence is possible at all. So these were two big learnings. The third one, which I think is very important that I want to put out there, is that as a wildlifer, I came in with a profound ignorance about how our protected areas have been created, how they have been carved out. So without looking at history, we really cannot descend upon the present and start taking things forward. And that's generally how I certainly did it that way. I descended into conservation and I thought I could take things forward without really understanding the history. If you looked at the history, the way forests were reserved, the opportunity that people were given to actually participate in this reservation process, and subsequently post the Wildlife Protection Act of 1972, the way the provisions by which we created spaces that are relatively protected from human impacts, the way they have been created, particularly the way those provisions that ensure due process, that ensure fairness to communities whose lives might be affected, how they have been consistently ignored over time. We really then discover that there is a large, dark cloud under which we are continuing to do conservation. And I think we have not distinguished ourselves in terms of the amount of heed we have paid to the enabling, the provisions of the Wildlife Protection Act, which we cite now as the Holy Grail. We have really overlooked many of its provisions. And I think these are three very important things that come in. And finally, I think, I also became much more aware, as I am right now, that often we are speaking for communities in all of these things. And we are not really speaking with them, as is happening here. I mean, or we may mean well, but that really doesn't give us the opportunity. And there are ways in which if you decide to deepen the empowerment of people, you will find different kinds of people in the conversation. And there is a deep discomfort with that in conservation as well. So these are a few learnings which I think I would use to frame this whole idea about, so there is an element of science, there is an element of values, and there are elements of governance. And these are three or four things that I thought I'd put out to begin with.
Thanks. That's a nice way of framing it in terms of the science, values, and governance, because it's the interface that's really critical. I'll turn to Ravi to comment on this as well. This whole issue, and as Madhu said, all of us were trained in the early days around this whole concept of disturbance, right? That was one of the first things we did was to look at how are humans disturbing the ecology, the habitat, etc. And what is your thinking around this, Ravi? How has it evolved in terms of these kinds of thresholds, disturbance, coexistence in these areas?
First of all, it's thanks, Madhu, for that wonderful statement. It's very difficult to beat his eloquence when it comes to such issues. What I would say is add one more frame, which is ethics and morality about how we work. I think that's an equally important, and the rule of law. He did talk about the Wildlife Protection Act, and equally important is the Forest Rights Act, both of which we know what the arguments are. I also got into thinking about wildlife and exposure in the early 80s, and we were clearly told that people and wildlife are immiscible. If you want people's life to improve, if you want them to develop, they need to be taken into civilization. And for wildlife to thrive, people need to move out of it. It was a clear Western model of the Yellowstone National Park kind of situation. And for probably the better part of 5, 6, 7 years, that's the way my thinking was. But it just took me to spend a few months in Gir to quickly figure out that's nowhere near the truth. Local people are seldom, at least in Gujarat, there are sections of our population where hunting or poaching takes place, but in Gujarat, that is not an issue. The bigger, more irreversible impacts are from people like us, our lifestyles, our demands, and what the government does in our name, in the name of development. Those are irreversible. The minute you fragment, degrade, destroy habitats, there's really no coming back. And there's no accountability for that. When it comes to local communities, there's this dream of an Eden, a kind of pristine, that's also a word that's often used in conservation, that we need pristine wilderness. With climate change operating on every square millimeter of this world, what pristine are we talking about? And who's responsible for climate change? So I think we need to be really clear about how India has managed to conserve. Great government intervention, great NGO intervention, but built on a foundation of how local people have lived, interacted, and revered nature. Not just a few species, but nature as an entire package. And that also, official conservation is still taking time to move away from species-specific interventions to a much larger, wider, and inclusive way of conservation. Not just in terms of excluding local people, but excluding a lot of taxa that needs to be done. The cheetah and the Great Indian Bustard are two great examples. The Great Indian Bustards are going down the chute. We are not able to pay attention to that, but look at the broha on the cheetah. How does it make sense? Indian science are doing great, but where is that science being applied? Why aren't scientists able to articulate based on their own work what is right, what is wrong?
I think, thanks for that really passionate, which always is great to hear, because it's so grounded. I think it goes back to also Madhu's first point about the science. What is the science for, and how is the science interfacing with these other values, which is morals, ethics, governance? Science in isolation is not going to solve your issues. But I'll go to Sharad. Has his hands up first, and then Asmita. Sharad, go ahead.
Yeah, hi Sejal. This is a really nice opportunity for us to have a conversation on a very vexed issue, as you said. I was hoping that my biologist friends, Madhu and Ravi, would actually focus on the biology a little bit more. But since they moved into the ethics, and I teach conservation ethics, I'm going to move into the biology a little bit, which is that, you pose the question as, under what conditions can tigers, or to what extent tigers can tolerate human disturbance? And Madhu rightly pointed out that is a fairly complicated question, disturbance being a complicated idea. But I also want to point out the flip side of the story, and I think the question we could also ask, and I was looking at some numbers, and the numbers are really, really startling. So Chandrapur district in Maharashtra is host to about slightly more than half the tiger population of Maharashtra, as per the tiger census, right? Now, this district reported 5 human deaths due to tiger attack in 2016, 11 in 2017, 17 in 2018, 24 in 2019, and 26 deaths in 2020, and 33 in 2021. Mm-hmm. So I think that is a fascinating statistic that asks us to ask the opposite question, which is, what is it about tiger biology that is sort of pushing or making tigers step out of their protected areas or large conservation areas? I mean, Chandrapur district has a huge area under conservation through the Tadoba Andhari Tiger Reserve and linked reserve forests. So what is it about the tiger that is actually making them step out and kill, not necessarily eat, just kill human beings who are very much on the fringe of their habitat? They're not, roaming around in the middle of the habitat. They're not carrying. So the latest death was in October. Gitanjay Sahu, my friend from TISS, works in Chandrapur, and a village where they were working on community forest rights. A person just stepped into the forest fringe, literally, within a kilometer of the village agricultural land, and was killed. 2 of them went in, and 1 of them, died. So it's just, to me, also equally important. And I don't know if biologists are looking at this question. What is it about the recent dramatic rise in human deaths because of tiger attacks? What does it tell us about tiger biology? Clearly, they have very well adapted to human presence and gone far beyond that. So I'm just curious about that.
And Sharad, this is also very complex raising, because equally, you have other areas of the country which have equally high tiger densities, but nowhere near the kind of human deaths. So it's not necessarily a one-to-one equation that you have more tigers, therefore you have more deaths. It's playing out completely differently in other places. So you're right, it's about understanding the behavior. We just don't have enough of an understanding to even draw conclusions, leave alone, trying to then set aside areas and decide who goes where and all that. I mean, on what basis are you deciding all that? Right. Asmita.
Yeah, thank you, first of all, to WWF and all the partner organizations who set this up. I wanted to sit with these gentlemen and with you, Sejal, to talk about this. And, thanks for making it happen. On disturbance, I think, in addition to the frames that are already there to think about this issue, I'd like to rephrase what Madhu said as, to make a distinction between use and disturbance. So the important issue to think about is scale. Because when we look at how much is used from a protected area, and what then becomes a tipping point, and one can find, for instance, people going in and grazing their animals, their livestock, or collecting fuel wood. Grasses are something that grow back again. Trees are again things that regenerate. So, on the other hand, what we don't ever think of as disturbing a wild habitat is when we decide to tile our bathroom the 3rd time and have a new sort of look for the house. So, the immediate very often gets seen as disturbance, even when it's at a lower scale, and the distant gets seen as something which is not really connected. And because those people who are distant can then kind of, simultaneously maintain an empathy for the tiger, but at the same time not see their own impact on the habitat of the tiger. So scale is one thing. distinguishing between uses at various scales. And the second, I think, is also the issue of incentives. So when we look at people and how they use areas. So I'm right now sitting at 18 kilometers from the east entrance of the Kuno National Park, from where you can walk in. But actually, as the crow flies, and from where I'm sitting, it's probably just a half an hour's walk. And if you look at the management plan of Kuno, you will find that historically, from 1905, the current management plan summarizes the previous ones. And they're talking about how the people of this area have actually used the salai tree, for example, Boswellia serrata, sustainably, using this very interesting system of governance where the tree is divided, I mean, the salai forest is divided between people as what the management plan says are salai khet. So, the forest is divided like individual farm plots, and people have been using this. But now with first the Asiatic lion conservation taking people out of that forest, and then now the cheetah project, people's access has stopped. And the incentive then to nurture an area long term kind of goes away. And that again is something that needs, so incentives of who's governing the area, what role do people have, and what incentives do they have to use wisely are important things to look at. So disturbance is a complicated concept which needs to be complicated further, both in terms of how humans look at forests and how certain mega carnivore species behave.
So Asmita, this is, you've raised something which is a big bugbear for me. This whole business of, you said that trees grow back, grasses grow back. And this is what, I argue all the time, is that actually, using firewood for cooking is perfectly fine. It's sustainable. Firewood grows back. Why? But the problem is that there is a mindset issue here. And it's a mindset that you see people using firewood, or you see people using trees, you sort of have this red flag to say this is disturbance, this is bad, this is not good for wildlife. So it's almost ingrained into managers' minds, and it's very hard to get that out to say it's okay. It's a source of fuel, just like any other source of fuel. If it is the most accessible and cheapest fuel, that's what you'll use. As long as you're using it in some manner that is not completely destroying it for your own use in that sense. Sharad, I want to come back to you. It's sort of linked to this issue and this narrative that we're discussing, and the narrative of exclusion, which is kind of inbuilt, and this whole idea of inviolate areas, core areas, and the absolute kind of thought process which says that without these, conservation will not succeed. This is, and you've argued against this. I've read some of your stuff. So can you, for the sake of this conversation, help try and rethink this idea? Is if not core areas, if not inviolate areas, if not, what is the alternative, and how do we make that happen? What's the vision? How would it work?
So let me preface my comments by saying that, it's not exactly an either or. I mean, if you look at even traditional practices followed by, let us say, Adivasis in, deep Bastar district, right? They have their own notions of inviolate areas. They will have hills or particular patches in the forest which are supposed to be kept inviolate, where they will not do hunting. Sacred groves or particular locations. It could be very small, it could be very large, it could be a whole hill. Where you're not supposed to do hunting, we're not supposed to even collect firewood, but they're not necessarily doing for only biological reasons, but for religious sacred notions of inviolate spaces, right? So there is a space even in traditional approaches to conservation, Adivasi approaches to conservation, that includes this idea of inviolate. But it's a very layered and very nuanced kind of idea, and you may have many small inviolate spaces rather than one big 500 square kilometer kind of thing, right? That's number one. Number two, I think it's clear, and this picks up from Asmita's point, which is that if you trace the history of inviolate spaces, and this idea of inviolate spaces in the modern sort of conservation lexicon, it completely correlates with the creation of an urban elite, right? An urban elite which is distant from the forest, from the tiger, which is not facing the consequences in terms of losing their cattle to the tiger, or losing possibly their own lives to the tiger, or having the elephant eat up their crop, and so on and so forth. They have, in fact, even also tried to keep the mosquitoes away from themselves, to the extent that we can succeed in urban life. So we have, once we distance ourselves from the vagaries of nature and the downside of nature in some sense, then we can talk about pristine nature. Then we can talk about beautiful nature. Then we can talk about the need for wilderness. But we are not living in wilderness, but we want that wilderness out there. So at somebody else's cost, obviously. And that's very clearly correlated with this, our ability to move away and create an urban space and a very comfortable life based upon highly unsustainable use of resources and the appropriation of resources from that hinterland. And I think so it really is a question of what is our position in demanding. The people who demand inviolate spaces really need to reflect upon where they are coming from. Where are they? And if we cannot reconcile, if we cannot convert our own backyard into an inviolate space, and on what basis are we asking somebody else to give up their backyard in order to create that inviolate space? I think that, to me, is an absolutely central question. The third point is that the issue of outcome versus process, right? I think Madhu started with this, Ravi also mentioned it. All of us, and I include myself in the same category. My introduction to environmental studies is through being a wildlife, hobbyist, by being a bird watcher, and then doing certain amount of wildlife tourism when I was in IIT Bombay, and really sort of enjoying it like everybody else here, and then comparing who saw the tiger first and how many tigers did you see, etc., and being envious about somebody who saw 6 of them when you haven't seen any. From there, I entered the field of environment, and for a long time, for me, conserving the environment, or various kind of environmental, shall we say, being an environmentalist was about outcomes. It was about, we need to have sustainable water use, we need to have clean air, we need to have tigers conserved, etc. All the good outcomes that we can think of, right? And hidden in that is the idea that we can do anything that is required to get to that outcome, because I know that it is the right outcome. And I think for me, the big learning of the last 30, 40 years of my engagement with the environmental question is somewhere maybe 15 years ago, it slowly dawned on me that, this is not good enough. This exclusive focus on outcomes assumes that I know what is good. I know that tigers need to be saved. Not only that, of course, I know that my biology is telling me that it needs inviolate spaces, but even otherwise, that the tiger needs to be saved at any cost. And I think for the last 15 years, I've moved into the point about that process is as important as outcome. And we cannot prejudge the outcome saying, I know the right combination of tigers and, development spaces and cities and rural areas, what right combination is correct for our society. It's completely absurd that I would know that combination. But this assumption is something I need to loosen up and focus on the question of process, as Madhu pointed out, as Ravi pointed out, that we have laws and we have revised those laws. We have tried to move away from a colonial legacy, and we need to start thinking about the process much more, because even if we, as I said, there is space for inviolate spaces in a sense, but who will determine when, how, which space should be converted to an inviolate space or be kept inviolate is something very important. And I think there the whole question of process becomes important.
Yeah, no, critically important. Asmita, I'll come to you, but I want to just go to Ravi for 1 second, because this is something that we and Madhu, probably you as well, as conservation students or as conservation biologists, in the Indian context, especially, this whole core buffer zonation and stuff is kind of almost like a mantra. And it's still there. I mean, the thing is that if you go into any meeting of a certain kind, it's, I mean, the narrative has not changed in 30 years, 35 years, 40 years, maybe. they're still talking about the same stuff. Whereas, there's this whole sort of explosion of new ideas and models and stuff that's going on outside. So what I'm still struggling to figure out how do we actually get into this to talk about the kind of narrative that Sharat just described. That yes, there is a space for these kinds of areas, but the way you do it, how you do it, who determines it, and it's not a fixed, single fixed approach of every protected area has a core buffer and only that's going to work. Will it ever change? I mean, what's your sense of what will it take?
Conservation doesn't happen in vacuum. It's happening in the socio-political, cultural context in which we live our lives. If the society is not law-abiding, respecting rule of law, how do you expect those involved in implementing conservation suddenly to be law-abiding or be nuanced or move away from top-down orders, but look at things, especially in a large, diverse, biologically and socio-culturally diverse country like India, with strong, long, valid traditions of engagement with management of nature. Rich vein of knowledge, practical exposition of how these things work, very site-specific, and notions of sacredness. I mean, no law is going to bring that into people's life. And if you don't work with that rich material, you're constantly pushing back on local people and you're pushing them over the limits. You're not only denying them, you're disrespecting what they've brought to the table. But fundamentally, I think it goes back to two notions. This concept of pristine nature and more is good, or obsession with numbers as a metric of conservation success sucks. Numbers are important, can never be the only parameter of success. And it's a false parameter of success because habitat integrity, habitat quality, habitat connectivity is lost when we only look at increasing numbers. And increasing numbers beyond a point of time is actually a problem and not necessarily a sign of solution. Whether things will change, it can change if more and more people are exposed to these realities and not continuously sold this notion of pristine nature and that people are bad for conservation. All of us are involved in teaching. I think we need to bring this out both in teaching students as well as in all our engagement with training of forest officers and other government officials and our policy engagement. And I think all institutions involved in this need to bring this more mainstream in these conversations and not shy away from raising these tough questions.
Thanks. Change is slow, but unfortunately, it's too slow sometimes. So, yes.
To add to that...
sorry, Madhu, Asmita had a hand up before.
Sure.
So I'll let her go first. Asmita.
Thanks. So from having thought long and hard about, first, there is a lot of agreement in this panel. And in that sense, I think what I'd like to do is to address the skeptics who might be out there because we are all agreeing too easily with each other. And so firstly, I think that we need to in terms of how do we change this? Yeah, because we can keep saying this and, change in classrooms, etc. is slow. But first, I think we have to recognize that, yes, conservation is important. It's also a crisis that we are facing. But very often, if crisis narratives lead to panic thinking, do something now or else we are sort of, this is going to go away, then that kind of, I think panic is the enemy of complex thinking. And complexity is something which from field experience, we will all agree that complexity is a fact of life. So when we start the discussion on, say tigers versus tribals, that's an example to me of non-complex thinking. Or, nature is out there and people live in sort of civilized spaces and everybody needs to be brought there. Again, an example of, non-complex thinking. Also, empathy is important. But for instance, when we start thinking, for instance, of bringing the best laws, which will then solve the problem of conservation, bring a stronger law, go to the courts, get an injunction through, whatever it is. For instance, from all our sort of field experiences, and not just here, but worldwide, what are designated as protected areas may not actually be inviolate in reality. They exclude some people, but others have the right to go in. And I don't just mean the tourists and the scientists and the foresters, but also within the local people, others go in and use them. Yeah. What then we need to do is to understand that this is a complex reality. Who is going to do conservation? What drives those narratives? All of this requires sort of, dialogic and sort of, it requires us to grapple with complexity and embrace it and then move beyond it. If we do magic bullet solutions, get all the people out or get a law, or these magic bullets, like all other bullets, kill. And that's something that we need to remember. So the only other thing I want to say at this point is that even thinking of the idea of, tigers versus tribals, for instance, as a trade-off, is exactly this idea of simplistic thinking. It doesn't have to be. If we just start from this point that this is not a tenable trade-off. We would want, basic human rights to be respected, and then figure out ways of doing conservation. Then the dialogue starts. But if we don't do that, there is a problem.
Yeah, I mean, to my mind, every time I hear these things, tigers versus tribals, development versus conservation, I mean, you just want to kill it. Because that's not the starting point that you want, and I mean, I wish I could just ban those terms, but anyway, as we said, banning is not the answer to anything. It's much more complex than that. I will go to Madhu. He's been wanting to say something.
Yeah, I mean, just to add to all the things that the others have said so far, I would, I completely share Sharad's view, and I'm sure others do too, about the need for inviolate or well-protected spaces. I think they're very important. But there are two things that this opens up. One is in terms of the science. What is the basis on which we are going to determine whether a place needs to be inviolate? Who's going to determine? So that's the information part. And then there is a process part about who's going to determine what constitutes inviolate, what constitutes disturbance, what constitutes its absence. And I think there it's very useful. As biologists for a long time, many of us biologists are used to thinking like the tigers need. What do tigers need? And I think when we think of what tigers need, I think the answer is very complex. Tigers need prey. Tigers need spaces in which to survive and reproduce, and the conditions in which they can survive and reproduce. And as Sharad pointed out, a very telling example of the tigers not knowing that they really need to stick to the inviolate spaces. Tigers are wandering into cultivated and inhabited landscapes, and there is a huge amount of interaction which has led to very disturbing consequences in terms of what it has meant for people. So tigers, these are evolving species to stick to biology and in some way respond to what Sharad is saying. These are species that are not going to sit and watch. Evolution constitutes a life force in an animal that behaviorally adapts, and many of these are either inherited or culturally transmitted to other individuals. So the tiger of our imagination only exists in our imagination. The tiger of reality is much more willing to live in inviolate spaces, in inhabited spaces, and so on, as the conditions might be. And that is something where we as biologists really have to play catch up. It's not, we don't get to decide what tigers do, or we have not cracked the evolutionary problem so well that we know what tigers are going to do next. But this is true not just of Tadoba and Chandrapur. Many places where there are tiger populations that are doing well, we see more and more examples of tigers, going to landscapes outside, even breeding in many of these places, using them as habitats. This was not the tiger biology that I grew up being taught. So there is the science and the biology to it that tries to say this. And second is about when we try to superimpose this on top of our management arrangements of what's a core and a buffer. This is how we constitute inviolate areas, right? Every tiger reserve for the first 20 plus years that I was, as a student in the Wildlife Institute of India, we were taken to many of these and we were shown maps of what is core and buffer. Every tiger reserve started where the forest boundary began. And for several kilometers inside, it was the buffer. And then you got into a core. Now, I didn't draw those boundaries. Don't ask me on what basis they were decided, but I look up to the wisdom of a lot of people who have thought these out. So there was a large area of forest that was a buffer and a large area of forest that was a core. Now, 2007, everything changes. Everything that is up to the edge of the forest is core. And the buffer is your backyard, my backyard, and everything else. That is the buffer. So now I don't know what science actually tells us that could allow us to make this determination that an area that had been treated for 35 years as a buffer suddenly is the core, and something that was never a part of our imagination of tiger conservation today is the buffer. So that's, yes, of course, there is a zone of influence, people come in, all of those things. But I'm trying to say that these are constructs, and they're important constructs. And when we don't do these properly, what constitutes disturbance? If I'm willing to say that, the fact that you go and gather a headload of fuel wood is inadmissible because this area is inviolate, and you will not ever have the same idea of disturbance applied to hordes of tourists that come into the same area where more roads have been built to create where there is much more noise, pollution, all of those things. And our tiger reserves have seen like orders of magnitude greater increase in tourism. That is not disturbance, nor is it disturbance to drown at several thousand hectares of a tiger reserve. That's not disturbance either. So therefore, we have to then ask, if we try to shortcut process and saying how have we determined disturbance, and it's easy for us to decide, okay, there are some of us who are wise will decide what is disturbance. And when you do that and take the shortcut, what happens is that these contradictions emerge, and that's what makes this an equity issue. So all of us would really like this to be technical issues, but they become more normative issues because of how we use how we use technology and science in this case as a tool. When we use science as a tool, we have created a science that will tell us that tourism is non-extractive and therefore it's all good. We are still inviolate. But one headload is a very serious problem because it's extractive. There you go. So then, and when there is an extractive example like a tiger reserve being drowned, then you will have to ask for, if you really do believe in inviolate reserves, are we going to just accept those realities, or are we going to confront these? That we do not have the space for the most marginal and vulnerable of our people to carry a headload on which to cook a meal, but we are completely willing to drown large extents of forest and still say that it's an inviolate reserve. It doesn't do anything to the inviolacy of the reserve to drown out large portions of it. This is where I think what you start out as an issue that's technical ends up becoming normative. And it is, we cannot, and that's what makes our issues of conservation of tigers not just issues that are of science, they're also of values. And it becomes an equity issue. Who gets to decide what is fair?
Yeah, this is another thing that we've sort of talked about for a long time, is that communities are the soft target, right? So they get blamed for everything, and the larger development processes that are having much larger impacts because they're so difficult to tackle, we kind of either pretend they're not happening or make some half-hearted attempt to address it, but then just shrug our shoulders and live with it and say that's inevitable. But at the same time, we keep targeting the communities. Because they're there, they're visible, they are the soft targets. So I think you're right. It's an absolute equity issue and a fairness issue. of how we deal with this. Ravi, do you have your hand up for this, or is it a new old?
Yeah,
hand?
on this.
Okay.
First of all, I think we should not use inviolate in our lexicon. I think it's levels of protection, because really nothing is inviolate. And we can end up strengthening that argument if we also start using that term. I think we should take that out of our lexicon. But more importantly, in terms of the biology part, tigers live across variety of habitats, live across variety of human use. And WWF research talks about sugarcane tigers. I mean, we've known about from Dudhwa days, but increasingly we do know that tigers can tolerate human disturbance. It has its consequences. So it really is a trade-off. You can't say that people can't go into tiger reserve, but it's okay for tigers to come into human habitations. So that's really where the conflict is. And talking of headloads, tourists not only cause all that Madhu said, they also enjoy bonfires, which burn a lot more wood probably than that single headload that person is taking out. So there has to be a much stronger lens on all of this. But the big development, it's power dynamics. It's political, it's power dynamics. And the less we don't talk about it, it just undermines our legitimacy to be saying we are trying to do conservation.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. So before we leave this topic, I want to just share, I'm going to come to you, but with another question as well. Before we leave this topic of this zonation or inviolate areas, I want to ask you, Sharad, about the critical wildlife habitat concept. You've again written quite a lot on it, and I'd like to understand from you, how is that different from what we're talking about?
So just to add a little bit to the last conversation, I think you had asked this question, how do we change, right? And that leads to the CWH because, and I'll come to that in a second, but I think change can happen from two ends. One is changing mindsets, and the other is changing the law or the structure within which we operate, whether we like it or not, but saying this is the law, we have to work with it, right? So talking about mindsets, I mentioned the first part, which was that only when we are away from the forest, we're sort of developed enough that we are living away from the forest and not feeling the downside of the forest, that we can talk about how wonderful the forest is or how wonderful the tiger is. But overlaid on that, I think, and this is something for all of us to reflect upon, is also a social dimension to it, which is why do we say that there needs to be invalid areas at any cost? Because the people who are living and who will be affected by creating an invalid area and eviction and so on and so forth that is concomitant to that process are people who don't matter in our mindsets, in our ways of thinking, because they are Adivasi. That means they are by definition backward. So there is a whole race, class issue, caste issue, which is intertwined with the question of, I'm living in a comfortable urban area and then talking about wilderness and pristineness and lovely tigers. Intertwined with that is this class and race issue that those people are either backward and they don't matter, or they are, so stupid that they don't know that what is best for them, which is to come out and live in cities or live like city dwellers and so on. So I think one of the things that has also made me think about this a lot is to see the caste and class structure of our forest service, our administrative service, and our conservation service, if you want to call it that, the entire conservation lobby, and who is demanding this and with what mindset. And I'm not blaming any individual. I come from the same kind of upper caste background. And so how are we brought up as children? How are we socialized as adults in terms of viewing others? And caste is so deep in our own urban society that you can imagine what it is when we go out there and look at people, who for us are really the sort of almost not people, right? So I think this is something we have to really look inward. Coming to the structural change, I think the structural change is already upon us. As you said, the Forest Rights Act lays down the idea of critical wildlife habitat in section 4.2. And so it's really important for us to understand what that section is trying to do. So the section is trying to reconcile, on the one hand, the need to correct historic injustice, the need to recognize that communities of forest dwellers were always, had customary rights on these forests, and we need to restore those rights that were taken away by the colonial British government and then continued to be taken away by the Indian post-independence government. So on the one hand, it is restitution of customary rights with the idea that, well, but there is also a larger public interest in conservation, and acknowledging the biological possibility that at some point the exercise of community forest rights could be detrimental to the interest in wildlife conservation. And it is not saying the interest is only with, only for outsiders or only the state has an interest in conservation. It's just saying that the conservation interest is important, and there is a possibility that at some point there might be a clash or a tension. Having acknowledged that possibility, so you have created a section 4.2, which then lays out a very detailed bottom-up process for creating critical wildlife habitat. It says that first of all, you need to recognize the rights. So you cannot talk about critical wildlife habitats. In fact, even in the CTH provisions of the WLPA, you cannot talk about CTH without first having recognized the rights. And this is where the whole process has gone topsy-turvy. The Forest Department and the conservationists think we need to first recognize critical wildlife habitat, because that's the way of essentially preventing communities from getting rights there. That's how they are looking at CWH. But the law is very clear. You first need to recognize rights. Then if for some reason, through some inkling or some flash of insight, you think that there is a threat to the existence of wildlife. And mind you, the words used are threat to the existence of wildlife. There's a certain threshold that is being set. It's not just about, well, you might have slightly lesser tiger numbers. Some these talking about some very serious threat. So if there is a serious threat, how do you determine that this threat is really there, and what do you do about it? Is laid out in a very detailed process. So the state government must form a committee. That committee must contain not just ecologists, but also social scientists. It must contain representatives of the local community, and they must collectively, through public hearings, come to a determination that the exercise of the newly recognized rights will result in this kind of a serious threat. And mind you, one thing I do want to point out is that you cannot extrapolate from current use of forest to the possibility of future use, because once you recognize rights, the behavior of communities changes, because now they have control over the forest. Now they can exclude others from randomly or arbitrarily using the forest. So they can themselves create inviolate areas. You take the example of Pasgaon in Chandrapur again, where they on their own have created a sacred area within their community forest resource. 1,800 hectares. They have about 40 hectares of inviolate area. So communities will change their behavior. And so you really cannot extrapolate from today and say, oh, there will be the same kind of grazing, or grazing will continue to increase, and so on and so forth. So you have to first allow them to create their own CFR management plans, then see whether those plans will still constitute a threat in some fashion. Then it allows you to determine whether, for instance, modifying the rights will be sufficient to ameliorate the problem. That is something you have to consider. You have to consider whether coexistence is possible in any fashion, such as modifying rights. So you might just say, well, just reduce grazing in a certain area, or don't do NTFP collection, or over there, and so on and so forth. There could be a variety of ways in which the rights could be softened or reduced or modified in some ways. And at the very extreme stage, you say that, well, coexistence is not possible, therefore we need to think about relocation. And there is a certain ambiguity in the act as to whether the modified rights version is also a critical wildlife habitat, or whether you have to evict people before you can call it a critical wildlife habitat. In my opinion, once you've determined an area to be important, it could still be community managed. It could still be part of CFRs or multiple village CFRs, and communities could have ways of managing which are not the full exercise of their community rights, but a modified version of that, right? And they might choose to use compensatory mechanisms like controlling tourism and earning from tourism rather than making a livelihood purely out of forest produce. And these options have simply not been explored because we don't even have an understanding of the CWH provisions. That's why I posted, I hope this has been circulated to the audience, our report on CWH. And I hope we can actually try it out in a few places before we say that, this law, what is this law about? It's really about trying to initiate a bottom-up co-management process.
Thanks. So that, I was going to come to the CFR, and I'm also going to come to relocation. in a second. I've got Asmita and my sights on that. But before that, I just want to ask a slightly more generic question. Sorry, it's a bit of those oversimplified questions, but I just have to ask it because it's something in my head. So the whole FRA issue, right? Many years back, I remember when FRA first came into being, we had a meeting where we brought a bunch of organizations together, both for and against, and we had this big debate, and we talked at that time about critical wildlife habitats, and there was that whole sort of for and against kind of argument. Now the thing is that even today we're still seeing a divide around the Forest Rights Act. I mean, we're still seeing people who are arguing that this is going to be the death of India's forests, it's going to be the death of India's wildlife, is the worst thing that could have happened, and people who are arguing that absolutely not. This is, it's an opportunity for actually having community managed wildlife and forests and stuff, and it is possible to achieve these goals. So, while this is oversimplistic, it's not one extreme or the other extreme. How do you, I'll start with Sharad and then Madhu, Ravi, and others. How do you see this playing out? Is there what do you see as the future of FRA implementation and moving forward in India? Where is it going to go? I mean, are we going to continue to fight about this? Are we going to continue to debate? Are we continue to do half-hearted measures? Are we going to, continue to pull back, push back? All of this is happening. Or are we going to accept and find those models that you're talking about, those adaptive models, which is the only way to go, because we're only going to learn by doing, and then sort of find that sweet spot where it becomes accepted and the norm. Where are you seeing this going?
I mean, I am really actually very hopeful. I think in the last several years, the real focus that the FRA should have brought in much earlier, which was the community forest rights, which is, so as talking about binary thinking or oversimplified thinking.
Have you lost him?
Every forest dweller 4 hectares of land, handing over 4 hectares of forest to every forest dweller. This is the most mischievous and stupidest and false interpretation of the FRA, right? But even focusing on the question of individual rights, recognition of past cultivation, is in a sense a distraction from the core pro-conservation measure in the FRA, which is the recognition of community forest rights, that is the rights of the community to manage the forest. Now, luckily, I think Maharashtra has set a really good example. It is stuck at the point where, so it was, I think, comfortable somewhat in recognizing community rights in non-PA areas. And it is now really reaching the point where the community forest rights recognition process has hit the PA boundaries, and there is a lot of back and forth and tussle going on, as we see in Medghat, and zero recognition in Chandrapur, but actually a beginning has been made in Medghat because of Purnima Upadhyay's and Khoj Medghat's efforts. So I think we need to jump into that place or those kinds of spaces and contribute to coming up with alternative scenarios. It's not only about the naysaying, it's not only about criticizing one lobby, criticizing the other lobby and so on, but really trying to come up with co-management plans, which so that there is a certain push, there's a certain validity that even at least some of the forester lobby sees that there is a basis for thinking about co-management. It's not just a dream, it's not just this kind of something hand-waving thing out there. So I think there is a space, and that space is going to increase. Chhattisgarh has recognized rights in Sitanadi Udanti Tiger Reserve. It has recognized rights in Achanakmar. And I think what we are missing now is actually a group of people coming in and contributing to bottom-up co-management plans. I think it's going to be really an exciting time for the next 10 years.
Yeah, good. So you're hopeful, and that's nice to see. Ravi, you have your hand up. Asmita, Madhu, your thoughts?
For me, there is a structural problem, especially with the CWH provision of the Forest Rights Act, because that section is subject to MOEFs coming up with guidelines and taking the lead on implementation. And we all know that in general, the Forestry Service is not favorably oriented towards the Forest Rights Act. And that's a pity because 2006, it's more than 15 years since the FRA has been implemented. And currently the strongest provision for conservation, which is in the Indian Constitution, it's even stronger than the critical tiger habitat, the critical wildlife habitat. And that has not been implemented. I mean, of course, the process is very important. We've discussed enough about the process, but there's clearly an ideological kind of a problem there. And I think while I like the optimism of Sharad and the fact that CFR is gathering momentum, is reached the boundaries even of a tiger reserve, but to move the next step to CWH is going to really take major reorientation within the Ministry of Environment. They need to come up with guidelines which are in concert with the spirit of the FRA and not try and find how to undermine FRA even more. The very fact that the 2006, if I remember correctly, the amendment of the WLPA, the creation, there was no critical tiger habitat till then. It was in response to the critical wildlife habitat provision of the FRA. And it was evidenced by actually in your WWF conference room when the then Secretary General or Director General of NTCA was explaining to the then minister saying, there is no need for CWH as far as we are concerned because we have CTH, as if, one replaces the other. So this needs to be addressed head on. We cannot keep, walking around it without, as if it's a bunch of eggshells. Now, FRA, again, we talked about it is about power dynamics. It's about one department versus the other, one class of our citizenry against another class of citizenry. So this trying to just use science to make this happen is not, it is going to require some muscle flexing, people power, and how we facilitate this for positive outcomes so that there are only winners. It doesn't have to be one side winning and the other side losing. That frame of thinking mindset also needs to change. This us versus them, there are only a certain segment of our community which benefits from that, and we need to call it out. We've been too patient, accepting of this thing of pointing fingers and so on and so forth. Some institutions have also been involved in that. I think it's time to change now.
Yeah, I mean, there's a huge lot of issues in what you just said. Everything ranging from, to some extent, even a lack of understanding, to of course mindsets and to power dynamics and a lot of that. But I'm kind of in Sharad's camp here. I'm kind of thinking that if we just ignore all this for some time, ignore all this background noise, just get on with actually developing those plans, getting the communities involved, demonstrating how they can be implemented, and let the change come from the bottom. And then hopefully, the people will see what's happening. But we can argue about this till the cows come home and keep on, finding sides and stuff. But in the meantime, it's great to see that there is a whole group of people and organizations that are getting on with it on the ground, which is also happening at the same time. That momentum is also building. So
just a quick word. I completely agree. I'm completely supportive. I'm just overlaying it with the other set of issues.
Yes.
It's not an either or kind of situation.
I know, but sometimes it's good to dwell on the positive, right? Smita, you had something to say.
Yeah, finally some disagreement on the panel. So I'm not as hopeful about the FRA for this reason, that I find that it has been successful by and large in places where it is driven by civil society. At least in my experience, and this is not just in Kuno and around, but also elsewhere, a sort of the organic ability among forest-dwelling communities to come together, especially for the CFR provision, is something that I do not see, nor do I see it emerging organically going forward, simply because we are talking about communities which are at the lowest rung of the economic and the social ladder. Food security, income security, all of these are becoming even harder. And in this situation, for us to place our expectations on these, and thirdly, these are very fractured communities which are becoming even more fractured. And there is no real sort of, one community which is there and wanting to protect forests. I think it's us projecting our hopes onto them. And I would really, one of the reasons I think that we place a lot of trust in civil society, but, paraphrasing Partha Chatterjee, I don't think the communities that we're looking at have that same sense of citizenship, and for good reason. They don't. And for us to expect that without, suo motu, in large swathes of our forest farm frontiers, this is going to happen. I don't think we are taking into account the fact that a majority of the people have sort of, they don't live off the land. A large part of their income comes from migration, mobility, wage work outside of the region they are in. And it is that allows, the conservation agencies in charge of these regions to then plug in and completely sort of take away this narrative by, for example, saying, this long fight, which, firstly, you have to feel a sense of citizenship to get into that long fight where you're actually fighting for survival. And in that situation, a sort of option of, okay, take this amount of cash and move out and sign this document, making it a voluntary sort of relocation. These are the kind of sort of strategies by which, the CFR provision, I don't really see it kind of taking off organically. Wherever it's taking off, it's through the efforts of people like us. There aren't so many of us. And even if we have to make it work, we have to really, really sort of, get our sort of political theory right here a little bit. What is it that animates these communities? What allows collective action to come up? What are the ways in which collective action is broken when it's emerging? And if you look at, mobilization, say, against some immediate threat to livelihood like displacement, even those are very hard to come by. Successful mobilizations that sustain themselves over time. The FRA is something that, it looms much larger in our minds than the forest farm fringe communities that I am familiar with. So I think, mobilization is possible. But again, like we said, that protected, spaces where tigers can thrive are important. Being wedded to the idea of the protected area or a national park may not be important. Similarly, the idea that people must be allowed the space to, have mixed use, mosaic landscapes where people and wildlife can coexist, thrive, etc. is important. But getting fixated on this law and then, so it's like this law came and then this CTH provision came to stymie this law. This is not a battle that is to be fought in the realm of the law policy, but it's actually a battle that's fought in the political arena, where we find many other examples of communities or collectives. Let's not just sort of, I use the word community with a lot of hesitation, because it implies a certain kind of homogeneity, which it is not, which I don't see in our villages. I see more divisions than homogeneity. And in these spaces and these landscapes, those alliances fight back, not necessarily always through laws, although laws provide a superstructure which sometimes they use. But there are many other spaces and political action that people do, which when we get fixated on the FRA alone as the vehicle for change, we tend to ignore it. So yes, this is an important law, but it's not the only tool in our toolbox.
Got it. So thanks. But I would still argue, and Sharad, I'll come back to you because I know you have a point to make, and Madhu as well, is being from that civil society sector that is driving or trying to drive the change, and thinking to whatever extent that we are doing the right thing by trying to drive this change, and hoping that the momentum builds up to the extent that we can then back off and it becomes a self-driven movement, because someone's got to drive something, right? I mean, that's the thought process where we are simplistically maybe coming from. It's interesting. It's interesting to hear your arguments and to think about, is this the best approach, or are we putting too much emphasis? And you're right, the Forest Rights Act obsesses us, but in many communities where you go, where there are external agencies pushing it, yes, it's on their agenda. But where there are no external agencies pushing it, it's not really on their agenda in many of these places. So it depends on how exposed they are and what the priorities are. So maybe, we need to rethink some of that. Thanks. Sharad.
Well, I do need to push back at Asmita, and I'm going to make 3 points or maybe 4. The number one, I think it's not an option. It's the law of the land, and the implementation of the law is not an option, right? And we need to use that as a starting point. And we need to also recognize that when you say communities are not particularly interested in CFR rights because they are doing other things, they are migrating, etc. Most of the time it's because they have never even heard the word CFR rights, because the government and the implementing agencies have never actually told people anything about CFR rights. They've only talked about aapko kheti ka patta denge. That's the only thing they've talked about for the whole 16 years that's the act has been in place. So I think we need to sort of recalibrate our assessment of what communities are doing based upon what information they have. And they really have very little information about these provisions in the law. That's number 2. And number 3, I think, yes, civil societies have, for example, been really instrumental in driving change in Maharashtra. But if you look at Chhattisgarh, for example, it's a combination of civil society and activist and popular pressure resulting in political change, and a commitment by a chief minister that he will actually implement the CFR provisions. And that's why you go from 0 to 3,000 or 4,000 villages, good, bad, ugly, all mixed combinations of, well done and not so well done community rights, but definitely a huge jump through a political process, which is what you pointed out, that it's not change doesn't come only through civil society efforts. So I think there is space. There are situations where the political system has also responded to the potential, the positive potential of community rights for their own reasons, perhaps. And I think just imagine if this conversation or many conversations like this resulted in conservationists who have traditionally opposed the FRA based upon, as I said, complete misconceptions of what it is, were to join hands with those groups which are working on tribal rights or forest dweller rights. Then you could have a completely different scenario where because the strength in conservation groups in terms of resources and numbers is unfortunately far more than the strength in those working on the rights of forest dwellers. So you could certainly have a doubling, tripling, or quadrupling of the effort in pushing for a bottom-up co-management kind of model.
That's really, Sharad, something that we must do. I mean, it's such a no-brainer that I'm just really frustrated that we've not been able to make it happen, getting together on that. Madhu.
I'd like to take this back a little more towards science. So how I've come at it as an ecologist, as a biologist, from the start, I have supported the Forest Rights Act. And so when it was the idea was, I was always open to the idea. And I think what science tells us, if anything, is that you really need to test your model or your beliefs against the data. And for that reason alone, I think science really requires you to look at your choices through the lens of this data. And now I think we've had quite a bit of a chance to interrogate these beliefs that we've held for a very long time against some of the data that we've managed to gather. And in fact, the government itself has managed to gather through its entire efforts of monitoring tigers and tiger reserves and populations and all of that. So the question is this: what is really needed for tigers to thrive? Tiger reserve is one of the ways in which we can really think about. It's not. I don't think the conditions that are required for tigers to thrive could potentially be created under one kind of an arrangement that may look like the tiger reserve of today under the legal arrangements of today. But it is entirely possible. And I, as a scientist, need to be open to the possibility that a completely different set of realities could also ensure that tigers could thrive. And today, I think we've had a chance to see many of these things. We've gone for a long time with the idea that, you get these villages out of this place is going to completely transform itself, and there'll be prey all over and tigers all over. It's 20 years since the 16 villages of Bhadra were relocated. I don't think there's any dramatic recovery either of prey or of tigers in that place. Similar things are happening with Satpura. So I think the idea, there are more things besides the presence of a few villages and the activities of those people that are keeping those numbers low. And that's all, as a scientist, I can see that this has established. Then let's look at the counterfactuals. There are places which have thousands of people who reside and use these areas, whether it's the BR Hills Tiger Reserve, BRT Tiger Reserve, whether it's Wayanad. These are places which have a density of tigers that might match or even exceed a Ranthambore or a Kana. So now, if as a scientist, if I have to see, I have to be open to the possibility that an idea of inviolate or highly restricted or strict protection might be valid in a certain place, in a certain context. But what the tiger is really not going to care about, whether your strict protection came from a government agency that is ruling with an iron hand and with the force of law, or whether it's actually a community through its own customary and other cultural mechanisms is able to ensure the same outcome. I don't think a tiger is really going to care about that. So this is something that I think we've also seen. We've had the last 15 years, I think, has given us that chance. And there I'm hopeful. But at the same time, we also have to recognize that there is the existence of this certain structure that prevails right now. There is a certain set of group. There are certain set of groups that it privileges. There are certain set of groups that it marginalizes. And where the privileges accrue right now, those people are not going to simply stand and part the way and then you can walk ahead with your more inclusive models of tiger conservation. It's going to be a struggle. And in that struggle, I don't think it's a panel discussion that will finally sort out how things work. It's going to be much more on-ground mobilization and resistance and acts of and various such actions that are going to be far more important than what we talk about. Finally, to summarize, here is basically how I see it as a scientist. I believe, let me begin with, unconditional positive regard for our wildlife protection act. Let's believe that it intended, as in a republic, which is a democracy, that the way we were going to conserve wildlife in 1972 was not by being unreasonable with our own people. That as a democracy, we were going to establish our desire to protect wildlife in a way that was at least fair to people and inclusive of that respected process. Let me begin with that. I think there are several sections in the notification of a wildlife sanctuary, national park, and subsequently tiger reserves that actually attest to this. But in their implementation, they've completely been ignored. Communities that have resided there for generations have simply, and all the processes that were supposed to have been followed under the Wildlife Act. I'm not talking of the FRA. If you had implemented the Wildlife Protection Act, you would have had to go out of your way to ensure that the rights of the people who were residing in these areas had to be recorded, and you had to follow a process by which you acquire or incorporate those rights into the area that you're trying to create. This has been short-circuited for reserve after reserve after reserve. And this, I think, it's very telling when you give the example, say, of a Great Indian Bustard Sanctuary, create 8,500 square kilometers, and it's a great aspiration, and it makes all of us happy who sit in faraway towns. But when you finally discover that the whole city of 5 tehsils, entire tehsils are shoved into one protected area, the entire city of Sholapur is within this, and finally you are in a situation where you are reconciling it to some 300 odd square kilometers of actual area that you can protect for the bustard. That's the reality. And similarly, it's not one place. Same thing has happened in Karera. Same thing has happened in Bastar. Same thing is happening in Shettihalli, where we are. So now we can see the absurdity of trying to shove a part of a Shimoga town or Sholapur into a protected area and saying this has to be inviolate. Of course, it's not going to work. But now, if there are people who lived there for generations, the absurdity of trying to put them into a protected area completely short-circuit the rights provisions of the Wildlife Act. It's to me unacceptable. So I started out as someone who believed that yes, if you have to make omelets or scrambled eggs, you have to break eggs, and these are the undesirable things. This is in the sausage making of conservation. These are things you really don't want to see. But in the reality of things, it's not really true. I think many things that should have happened within the Wildlife Protection Act and did not happen were what eventually got moved into a separate legislation. That's how I see it. So from the start, I have been a supporter of this, because not only am I a conservationist, I'm also a citizen of the country. The rights that this country protects for me, I would like to see available to another set of people as well. And I don't think there is anything that says why conservation of the tiger really has to be done undemocratically. And I think I really see the FRA as a deepening of democracy in the way we try to do conservation. Science is on board. Science is a very unruly master. Science it'll report to you that tigers will thrive in the presence of humans. It will also tell you that the models that you had of inviolate being always good, it may not work, and that's what science tells you. And I think if you have to reconcile this with the larger sentiment of making conservation more democratic, I see the FRA as a reason for hope. But like I said, this is not going to, right now, there is a monoculture of governance and management. And we are people who celebrate the diversity of nature. And here we are believing that there is one institution and one arrangement, and that alone that we can do conservation by. There is nothing more absurd than that. What I hear in what Sharad says is that there are a multiple set of arrangements. If in BRT Tiger Reserve, where virtually the entire Tiger Reserve is part of the rights that a community has, tomorrow, by some miracle, if the same conditions were to continue prevailing, but the management had completely handed over from the forest department to the community, what would the tigers care? And therefore, why should we, as scientists, ecologists, and conservationists, care about those governance arrangements so much? We should be open to them. We should really allow a polyculture, a diversity of governance and administration regimes also to inhabit the place where we are trying to protect our diversity of nature.
Yeah, so thanks. I mean, Madhu, what I take away from that very passionate speech is just this idea of the democratization of conservation. I think that's the takeaway for me from this entire conversation about conservation. Is that's where we should be heading, because we all want conservation, right? We all believe in it, but it's the how that is the real problem. And this whole issue of the Wildlife Protection Act, we've been saying that for years, that actually we have a good act. If it was followed in spirit and process, it's not a very, it's not a draconian act. It's actually got those provisions, but we've just ignored them in many cases. So I'm doing a time check. Ravi, you have a burning point, please do it, because I've got so many questions here that I don't know how to deal with it. The team has summarized the questions for me and they're rolling down on my screen. So I'm going to just do them in order, and we might have to leave a few. So I'm sorry about that, but I think they've also prioritized. And as Ravi said, put the difficult questions first.
Yeah, just two quick interventions.
Yeah, go ahead.
One, talking about the Wildlife Protection Act, it has an enabling provision for sanctuary advisory committees involving local communities. It's section 33B. I don't think there's one sanctuary advisory committee in this country. And this is a provision going back to 1972. And therein lies the problem. It tells you something as to how we are approaching this. The other point I want to make, Asmita has said what she said about FRA. FRA is under threat. It is under litigation. The Supreme Court is hearing it. There's a strong pushback about the very legitimacy of FRA. So that's the field in which we are playing. And we really need to try and find how to engage with this. This is being done in the name of conservation. That's the tragedy. I don't think we can wish it away. That's the prevailing reality.
a small point I want to make here. Yes, I think the pushback is strong and very real, but I think the one thing that we often forget is that we're very happy that zamindari was abolished in this country. The zamindari abolition was a land reform that really needed to happen in the agriculture, the production frontier, which was important, and it's one of the first things the new republic did. And the Zamindars Association went to court against it. So this is something that we should completely expect. There is a certain arrangement. So the reform that we are talking about happened only in the production landscape. Nothing came in terms of how the tenancy and all the kind of zamindari of some sort, if you could, the feudal system that we inherited that led to the way our forests, the creation of forest villages and all of those things were never touched. The land reform never percolated into the forests. So this is a much overdue land reform that started in the agricultural frontier, but needed to go all the way into the forest. That's happening. And this arrangement, when we do so, I think it will upset certain apple carts. And we should expect, like the Zamindars Association objecting to it, I think there is a certain set of people. We have a diversity of organizations and views in conservation. There are certain people who would really prefer to have conservation done through a strong centralized bureaucracy rather than through a decentralized set of communities, and they will object to it, and that's no surprise at all.
Normally at this stage we would do kind of a closing round of remarks, but let's instead, shall we, if the panelists are okay with this, can we just move to the questions? Yeah, you're fine. Okay, I'll start with a question which is kind of fundamental and something that we grapple with a lot. So I'm going to throw it to the panel because I don't have the answer. And the question basically is, thank you for a very enriching discussion. However, I'm still trying to understand who these local communities are, which is actually a pretty fundamental question because we use the term quite loosely, and we have been talking about communities. Does anybody want to take a crack at not necessarily defining, but explaining what we mean when we use this term? Asmita?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this goes back to something that Ravi said a little earlier, which is that conservation is something that is embedded in the larger sort of development narrative and larger society that we're living in. And for me, when we're looking at these communities, these are diverse, fragmented, groups which are people who used to make a living predominantly off the land, but increasingly in the last few decades do not make a living just off the land, partly because the land itself is limited, partly because a lot of the land has been taken away due to conservation. And all of these have made these very fractured, fragmented kind of groups which are trying to make a living in an extremely and increasingly difficult world. So the point that I was trying to make earlier, which I think, I would think that, progressive laws that empower people, deepen democracy, and at the same time allow us to save our biocultural heritage are important. But if we are to work with and through local communities, then we must start with understanding that these are complex entities with many concerns, including saving their natural resource base, because it's really the last fallback option, especially in these times where, the transition from agrarian to industrial livelihoods has not happened. So, people have aspirations. So these are aspirational groups which are very complex and not necessarily, and so the diversity is there in these communities also. And therefore, I think the point that I was trying to make was that we will have to look to a bouquet of legal and political strategies to deepen the democratic process of living more sustainably off the land, doing so by placing our faith in either a bureaucracy that has historically shown that it would prefer exclusionary conservation over inclusive conservation would not work. But these communities, given their complexity, will have to be included in these dialogues through not just legal, but also other, political processes that don't just bank on one or the other law. We will have to look at communities in all their complexity, and including the complexity that a lot of them look for urban lifestyles which are frustrated. These aspirations are not met, but they may not necessarily be looking towards forests and conservation as their priority number one. So those are the communities that I observe and I talk about and I talk to. And those are the ones for whom, planning a more socially just conservation landscape needs to happen.
Thank you. Thanks, Asmita. Sharad, do you want to add something?
Yes, I want to add to that because I think one can also look at it a little differently. That somebody's asking, what are these local communities? I'm saying, well, they're basically citizens that happen to live in areas which have been the focus of conservation attention for a long time and therefore been converted into protected areas in many cases, and where therefore there is a lot of this outside intervention in terms of you shall not go here, you shall not go there, etc., etc. It's a set of citizens that we are calling local. So they are local citizens to begin with. And then the word the local community can be interpreted in multiple ways. So they can be simply people who have been similarly affected by this kind of displacement, eviction, restrictions, high-handed conservation, bureaucratic conservation, top-down conservation, etc., without necessarily implying that they are a community in the sense that they have a shared cultural heritage, they are very equal, they are very homogeneous, etc., etc. The word community has many interpretations, but they are a set of citizens who happen to face similar kind of pressures and challenges and oppression because they are in places of high biodiversity and conservation attention. Number one. Number two, they are often composed of subgroups that are relatively homogeneous with respect to each other, but as Asmita said rightly, fragmented also. And they are therefore also far away from, just look at the 74th Amendment and cities and ask the question, how democratically are we running our cities? And how democratically can we run our cities? Even after the 74th Amendment, we are still a long distance away from realizing the spirit of the 74th Amendment. But the solution to that is not to say, let's throw away the amendment. The solution is to look for even, how do we actually make the spirit play out in reality, and the long fight that we have ahead because of that. So I think similarly, if we say that, well, the FRA is inadequate, yes, of course it is, because it is still situated within a larger context, which is hierarchical, socially, politically, and economically, and which is not particularly interested in the idea of democracy and deep democracy, certainly. But I think to me, it's just that there is FRA, there is PESA to some extent, there are other kinds of ways, we don't have to be legal ways. So the legal dimension has to be supplemented with social change and political change, no doubt about it. But to me, it's kind of not a question of, therefore, don't bank on it. It's more like that's an opening. To push through that opening, obviously, will not a legal, it's just the beginning. You'll need momentum that is built through social and political change.
So the next question is kind of linked. Again, a fairly fundamental one, and I think we've discussed it a lot. But maybe for the sake of the audience, just reframing it very simply. So the question basically is, how do we view Adivasis, and why is there such a reluctance to embrace FRA? It's, this comes at the core of what we've been discussing. But I think we've addressed this quite a lot, but maybe just a 2-sentence kind of reframing. So it's a thought that people leave with. It's an important one. Ravi, you want to say something?
It's a tough battle. It's about power. It's a tough battle. The Forest Department has got used to having absolute control over forests. Here is another department which will empower local people, which they see as an undermining of their powers.
Anybody else wants to add a one-line sort of response to this?
I mean, I just want to add that, reluctance by whom? So yeah, I think Ravi's given the answer. Why is the forest bureaucracy completely opposed, not just reluctant? Reluctance from the communities come, as I said, because of the misinterpretation or lack of information on what the FRA really is, and being drummed into their head. It's really about giving them pattas over land, whether or not they had rights to it. It is a political tool to garner votes. So reducing the FRA to just handing out pattas for agricultural land. So I think that's why communities are not going beyond that. They're just looking for that patta, because that's what they understand from the FRA.
What I might add is that the way I see it is that the Adivasi today is a community that is, in a sense, challenging the notion that if conservation is a fair end, are we prepared to achieve it through fair means?
Mm-hmm.
That really is the question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is. Okay. So another question. So I'm afraid these questions are incredibly long. So if I read out the whole question, many of them are actually comments to what we've said. So I'm trying to paraphrase some of it. So another question is around zonation, and I think, again, bringing in this idea of can we learn from other places and why does this not work in India? Parts of European cities have their geography divided into clear-cut areas, urban areas, wilderness areas, so urban areas where all development is focused and wilderness areas are therefore saved. Is that a better model of conservation? Would that ever work in India? So I think it's, again, important to address this and explain, why. Asmita.
Yeah, no, again, I think that this is reinforcing exactly the same binary that we are all trying to kind of argue against. And, in some sense, I don't even know that, which examples are being spoken about, because our urban areas aren't really areas without nature. And even the densest urban areas have and so much work in urban political ecology and urban ecology has shown that. So, I mean, while I'm not a great admirer of the new conservation's methods, but this movement where it said that, let's think of a world where our cities are a little more wild and our protected areas are a little more inhabited, is the way forward, rather than further attempts at partitioning that which actually was never partitioned. It was a Eurocentric imported way of thinking about nature, and we are carrying that baggage still. And instead of shedding that baggage, this kind of reinforces it to me. So we need to think about conservation as well as development as a way of being where we live more lightly on the planet, and we do so in a spirit of mutual respect between humans and non-humans. And we do so at using technologies and landscapes which are human scale and don't really involve gigantic alterations that actually do no good to the most vulnerable humans as well as the most vulnerable non-humans. So I wouldn't at all be comfortable with that imagination of the future. I think we need to grasp, the nature society sort of this thing as a continuum and not as partitioned.
Which was where we started the conversation around, and it's different people have different imaginations of how this plays out, and it's interesting to see how diverse that is as well. Ravi, you have a question? Otherwise, you have a comment? Otherwise, I'm going to go to the next question. Okay, so hunting is come up as a question. A lot of India's forests have very depleted wildlife. Local hunting is sometimes the cause. Is it conceivable that decentralized forest management will create space for forest residents to formulate and enforce rules that limit hunting, and that sustainable hunting can somehow be sanctioned? So the whole issue of how do we manage the whole hunting question? Who wants to go for that one? I'm looking at all of you.
Well, I mean, the legal position right now is there's no hunting unless something is declared a vermin, and that's also been going back and forth with respect to wild pigs in Kerala and Nilgai. I'm not sure. I think in some district there was and I don't know what the scene is on monkeys. Now, this is the problem when we try and fit one model to the entire country. I don't think there are easy answers, but if you respect people's rights as much as the right to work is fundamental as a citizen of this country. And for some people, and right to food also. And for some people, right to work and right to food is through hunting. So, I mean, I'm just throwing up more questions than answers because these are complex questions, and currently the legal framework doesn't allow you to explore it other than the chief wildlife warden calling either a particular population or a species vermin, or is it a rogue or a man-eater or something which is a threat to human life. These are the two cases under which animals can be killed today in India.
I would really like to go back to the Wildlife Act itself. When the Wildlife Act was passed in 1972, it had 5 schedules. And the first schedule was species that could not be hunted anywhere under any circumstance. And what Ravi is talking about largely pertains to how you make an exception for those species which you can't hunt anywhere. And that was not an exhaustive list of all species. Then we had schedule 2, 3, and 4, and 5 as well, which was vermin, in between, which were different kinds of game. This, I'm talking about the Wildlife Act. I think it was a much more reasonable formulation for the kinds of situations that we are beginning to encounter than the amendment that's happened somewhere midway, where all forms of wildlife in all kinds of situations forever and for all time in every place could never be hunted. And this is an unenforceable aspiration that rebels against the most, against both pragmatism and the ideals of how we want to conserve wildlife. I don't think, and certainly science, this makes no sense. I think we have a recourse to go back to. I don't think it was such a poorly thought out idea that to have. How do we implement it? It's an open question. I'm not saying there is a clear pathway that we can take, but I think in terms of understanding the complexity, the original template really accommodates this a lot better than what we are left with today.
Yeah, Asmita?
Yeah, also I think we need to make a distinction between, subsistence and commerce, and we need to take into account cultural factors and aspirations. We also need to balance those against, of course, extinction threats. But like grass grows back, like trees grow, animals also reproduce. And, tipping points are what we should be concerned about. And when we start sort of, taking this position, that, again, it's a way of sort of othering that, those, so there are, and that's a much, much more sort of complex debate about, the rights of non-humans as sentient beings, etc. So I'm not even touching that for the moment, except saying perhaps some of these questions come from those ways of thinking, and sort of, that's a big dialogue on which much has been written. But poaching for commercial purposes, perhaps easier to sort of take a position on. But hunting, which is a part of cultural rituals, etc., I'm not so sure that these are all to be put in the same box. And also, I mean, mortality is a fact of life for humans and non-humans. And, sort of, this is again something that, I mean, there's a certain death defiance in this whole sort of imagination that comes from, probably from a place of, distance from natural processes which you see as a part of your daily life. Also, I mean, hunting for subsistence versus having lifestyles that where we can meet our food needs through market and through other sort of provisioning methods. These are all things that need to be thought through. It isn't something that lends itself to a yes or no kind of answer. It'll be a grave injustice to the thing to actually think in those terms.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to, we're almost out of time, so I'm going to end with a last bit of a rhetorical question, but I think it's a good one to end with. It's a long question. I'm going to only read out the last part of it, which is the interesting part. It basically says that, isn't it that we have completely lost the flexibility with the design of our protected areas, as well as with what we expect from the communities and from wildlife? So in a way, it kind of summarizes a lot of what we've been talking about, is this whole need to adapt, to be flexible, to be inclusive, and not go for a rigid top-down kind of a model, and try and see how we can, with the momentum that's building up, whether for good or for bad, learn lessons from the implementation of the FRA, learn lessons from the models that are starting to emerge in terms of more inclusive conservation, and as we said at the beginning, the changing of the narrative, which may be a slow process, but at the end of the day, we do need to, I don't know, you use the word simplify because it's the wrong word, but we need to get this across in a way and to the people who are, to some way, powerful, making the decisions. Because if it's not getting to them, we're talking to ourselves to a large extent. So how do we actually do that? That's my vision, is that, someday, we've been talking similar language on this panel, that a lot more people out there are talking the same language, and it's not just us talking to ourselves. So that would be the day. But thank you again very much. It's been exhilarating. It's been such a learning process. And as Asmita says, we should be doing this anyway, debating and discussing and meeting on these issues, because that's how we push the bar. It took a Zoom call to get us together. So thanks again for everything. Thanks to the audience who've been listening and for the great questions that you sent in. And good night.
Thank you. Thank you all.
So we have a closing.
Oh, sorry. Please go ahead.
Hi, everyone. Thanks again for joining in today. Again, as you know, it was an amazing discussion. I learned a lot, and I think everyone who's been on this has learned a lot as well. We really love the conversation, and we look forward to having all of you join us again. As you all know, many of you who've been joining us over the last few months, we've been having this every month at the end of the month. Next month, December, we're not having one. We're going to just go into the new year, and we'll meet you in the new year again, end of Jan, hopefully, with the new session. So thanks again. Thanks to everyone, especially the panelists today, and Sejal for moderating this so well. I think we all learned a lot, and yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
And I also have to thank people who put this together. So the names are up there. Thank you. Thanks again.
Thanks. Bye.